Good Wednesday afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Southern Oregon Weather Midweek Update. Today we're going to figure out if rain and snow will finally return to Southern Oregon after a kind of hit and miss last few weeks, where we've seen systems mainly brush by to our north. We'll look at our snowpack and see what state that's in, and then we're going to try to figure out, is there a long-range pattern shift at the end of February going into March that could maybe promise some more rain and snow for our area. So looking at the current radar returns from the KMAX on top of Mount Ashland, there's really not a whole lot going on. Clear skies, sunny skies. It's in the 50s in Medford and in the 40s up on Mount Ashland. And the main reason for this is that we are sitting under a pretty strong ridge of high pressure that's dominating the western United States, that's driving most of the storminess into the Rockies and into the east. So is this pattern going to change? So far, this ridge of high pressure has kind of been sitting right off the coast down into California, and some systems have managed to drop down from the northwest, but they've mainly affected Washington and northern Oregon, while southern Oregon has pretty much been sitting dry for the last couple weeks. And this is primarily due to a combination of a negative PNA and a positive EPO. So when we have a positive EPO, a lot of cold air is bottled up near Alaska, and you can see that reflected in some of the blue and white colors up near Alaska. And that usually pushes the ridge farther south and prevents the storminess from dropping down into Oregon and northern California. As you can see, a lot of the storminess is being shunted over into the Rockies. That reflects a negative PNA pattern, but it's displaced to the east. Usually in a negative PNA pattern, we see a trough along the west, but in this case, the positive EPO is shifting that pattern over the Rockies. So in contrast, last year we had a negative EPO pattern with more of a ridge over Alaska, and we had storm after storm drop down out of the Gulf of Alaska on the backside of that ridge, leading to the abundant February snowfall that we had last year. So because of the dryness that we've been seeing over the last couple weeks, snowpacks have remained largely below average for much of the state. You can see the Rogue Umpqua Basin is currently sitting at 88% as far as snow water equivalent goes. So that's decent, and we've been holding steady over the last week or so, largely because this pattern, this positive EPO and negative PNA, has kept us from seeing really significant warmth. You see these lines on the backside of the ridge oriented kind of northwest to southeast. That means we've been primarily under north to northwest flow, and so that's kept temperatures from getting up really high into the 60s and has kept our snowpack in decent shape. So what can we expect going forward? Well, here's a look on the GFS model from the 18Z run that is just coming in now at the next little system that is moving in from the northwest. And once again, we see this weakening as it encounters the ridge over our region. We see it mainly affecting Washington and northern Oregon, but there's really not much in store for the southern Oregon Cascades and Siskiyous. Maybe a dusting to an inch around Mount McLaughlin and more for the central Oregon Cascades. Our next shot of rain and snow is looking a little bit better. This is going to happen about from Saturday afternoon into Monday, and we see a modest atmospheric river pointed at the Oregon-Washington border, and that's going to gradually sag southward over the course of the weekend, and how fast it sags and how far it sags will determine how much rain and snow we end up getting. Now, I expect this event to primarily favor the southern Oregon Cascades, so Mount McLaughlin, Howard Prairie, Crater Lake, of course, rather than the Siskiyous. And the reason for this is that the Cascades are oriented north to south, so that means that they're in a good position to catch moisture coming in from a westerly or zonal flow. Meanwhile, the Siskiyous are oriented east to west, and so they don't do really well when there's zonal flow. The Siskiyous tend to do a lot better for rain and snow when we have northwest or even northerly flow. And you can see at the end of the storm, heading toward Monday, that flow does shift to the northwest. So I would expect the Siskiyous maybe to pick up a couple extra inches on the backside of this storm, but I'd look mainly for the highest amounts to be, once again, from about Mount McLaughlin northward. And we see that reflected in the GFS total snowfall amounts. We see around 6 inches in the Mount McLaughlin area, maybe even a little bit more, rapidly increasing from Mount McLaughlin north up to about 2 feet near Crater Lake. But the Siskiyous look like they should see only about a couple inches, maybe 6 inches at most, for Mount Ashland if things turn out well. So is this pattern going to change in the longer term? This is the GEFS, so it's an ensemble, the average of many different computer model runs. So usually ensembles give you a slightly more accurate picture of what's going to happen versus just one model run like the GFS that I just mentioned. So this is a loop of about the next 16 days. So we're starting on Monday after the 2-week systems that we talked about are moving through. So here we see some brief ridging, the orange colors build over our area, and some storminess tries to sneak in from the northwest. Those are the blue colors. Then the ridge rebuilds over our area, but gradually you can see toward the end of the month it shifts off into the Gulf of Alaska, allowing that trough, that storminess, to dig into the west coast again. So we'll see if that truly happens. The GEFS right now is trying to take things into a more negative EPO state toward the end of the month, much like we saw last February. Will it produce the same amount of snow? Probably not, because we're heading into spring at that point. But it could bring us a pretty decent shot of more snow in March if this pattern pans out. So why is the GEFS forecasting this gradual pattern shift? Well, it's taking the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, into the Indian Ocean. That means phases 8 and then heading toward 1 and 2. Right now, most convective activity is located east of Australia into phases 5 and 6, where we've been seeing it for the last couple weeks. But you can see the GEFS is taking it strongly into phase 7 and then phase 8, and that typically leads to more storminess, especially for California, the undercutting of that ridge, the jet going south into California as we head into the spring. So you can see the temperature and precipitation correlations that are associated with phases 1 and 2, which it looks like that's where the GEFS is trying to take things. We see the blue colors for phases 1 and 2, meaning cooler temperatures, and then the green colors for 1 and 2, reflecting slightly wetter than average tendencies. So let's compare this with another model. This is the Canadian ensemble, the GEPS. Once again, we see some storminess trying to drop down from the northwest, but that ridge, once again, building off the west coast. It's pretty stubborn, but eventually the GEPS also shifts it off the coast with more of a negative EPO look going into March. So we have agreement from two models that a general pattern shift is going to take place. Now keep in mind, a couple weeks ago they were suggesting that we would see a similar pattern shift for early and mid-February. It didn't end up fully materializing. The ridge wasn't quite as far offshore as both models were suggesting. Instead, it ended up closer to the west coast, meaning we were stuck with some more dry, albeit cool weather, with most of the storminess going into the Rockies. So will the models be wrong again? Let's hope not. Sometimes the shortening of the wavelengths during spring can mean that even though the ridge is fairly close to the west coast, the trough digs in more sharply. So we'll hope that the shortening of those wavelengths can give us a boost in terms of rain and snow as we head into the spring. So here you can see where the European model is taking the MJO. The Canadian MJO forecast does not go as strongly into the Indian Ocean as the GEFS was showing, the American model. But the European model is also on board with the GEFS and showing initially phases 5 and 6, but then heading over into phases 8 and possibly 1 going into March. So that would be good news for us, and especially for California, which has had a very dry last couple of weeks. So in conclusion, there is a good chance for modest rain and snow this week, especially heading into this weekend, Saturday night, Sunday night. And again, I mainly expect the Cascades to do well with that weak atmospheric river system, because it is coming in on a zonal flow pattern moving from west to east, although the Siskiyou should pick up a couple to potentially several inches as well. And as we saw, there's a possible return to storminess late February into March. What we really have to hope for is an MJO that reemerges in phases 8, 1, and 2 into the Indian Ocean, and a negative EPO with ridging over Alaska, allowing a lot of cold air to drop into Oregon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to set your notifications for a weekend update, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content.